Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Health, Fair and Simple. My name is Lucas, and I'll be leading today's podcast episode. In today's episode, we'll be discussing language barriers in health and the bioethical issues that arise when communication is not fully accessible between patients, families, and providers. Today is April 3rd, and I'm recording from Surprise, Arizona. I'm excited to introduce our guest, Sonia, a speech and language pathologist assistant who works in an elementary school in Whitman, Arizona. In this setting, communication is at the center of everything, supporting students as they develop language skills that are essential not only for learning, but for expressing their needs, thoughts, and identities. Although schools are educational settings, I was really interested in highlighting how school-based speech services are health-related allied services that support communication, development, and long-term well-being. These services being offered in schools also connect to bioethics because communication support in educational settings is often less recognized and less represented than language access services in healthcare or medical environments. But yet, schools play a critical role in a child's development. Providing speech therapy promotes justice by ensuring students have fair access to learning, autonomy by giving children the tools to express themselves, and beneficence by supporting their long-term growth, confidence, and future opportunities. Beyond her professional role, she also brings personal experience navigating language barriers. She's spent time translating for her own family members in hospitals and doctor appointment settings, giving her a first-hand understanding of the responsibility and pressure that can come with bridging communication gaps in healthcare. In addition, she regularly translates for students and their families within her school and entire district, helping ensure the important information is understood and accessible. I was especially interested in hearing her perspective because her experiences in both education and healthcare-related settings. Her background offers insight into two worlds where communication is essential, yet often supported in different ways. From providing speech services in schools to navigating language barriers in medical environments, she brings a unique understanding of how communication access can shape fairness, opportunity, and outcomes across both systems. Through these experiences, she has seen how language barriers can directly impact access to care, the quality of communication, and the ability for patients and families to make fully informed decisions. While translation can provide connection and clarity, it can also raise important ethical questions, especially when untrained interpreters, like family members, are placed in high-stakes medical situations. In this episode, we're going to be exploring the bioethical challenges that arise when language becomes a barrier to care instead of an aid. How do providers ensure true informed consent when patients or families may not be fully understanding the medical information? What are the risks and responsibilities involved when a family member steps up as an interpreter? And also, how can the healthcare systems move toward more equitable and accessible communication for linguistically diverse populations? I'll be asking her about both personal and professional experiences and how they shape her understanding of these issues. We'll also discuss how ethical principles like autonomy, beneficence, and justice come into play when language barriers affect understanding, decision-making, and access to care. I'm really looking forward to hear her perspective and gain a little more insight about how something as fundamental as language can shape fairness in healthcare. Make sure to stay until the end of the episode where I'll rejoin the Health Fair and Simple podcast group to reflect on what we've learned and connect these real-world experiences back to the larger question of whether healthcare access is truly fair. Now, let's jump into the discussion. All right, everybody, welcome back. We are now joined with Sonia. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Lucas. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, if you don't mind, we're just going to jump right into those questions. So, starting off, can you tell us a little about your role as an SLPA and what your day-to-day work looks like in the elementary school?
Sure. I'm an SLPA in an elementary school. I work under the supervision of a speech language pathologist, and I support students with communication needs. My day typically includes working with students. We have one-on-one or in small groups. We work on speech sounds, language development, and social communication skills. I also help the SLP collect data on student progress, prepare therapy materials, and sometimes support classroom carryover of our goals. A big part of my role is also communication, and that means collaborating with teachers and, when needed, help bridge communication between school staff and families.
Nice. And what drew you to this field, especially working with language and communication?
That's a good question. I've always been interested in how people connect through language. Communication is such a core part of learning and relationships, and I was drawn to helping children find their own voice, whether that means improving speech clarity, building language skills, or gaining confidence in expressing themselves. So I feel that working in a school setting also appealed to me because of the opportunity to support children during such an important stage of development.
Oh, nice. Thank you so much for that.
Of course.
And now, in our prior conversation before this episode, you highlighted that you've translated for your own family members in healthcare settings. Can you expand a little more about how that experience has been like for you?
Sure. It has been both meaningful and challenging. On one hand, I was able to help my family understand the important information that it was given and feel more comfortable in a stressful setting. For example, I translated for my mother-in-law who did not speak any English.
And what language did she speak?
She spoke Portuguese.
Nice.
And on the other hand, it can feel like a lot of responsibility, especially when the information is complex or medical. I've realized that it's very important to be accurate, and that can be very stressful. So, to me, so nothing is misunderstood.
And can you describe a moment where you felt the weight or responsibility of translating in a medical situation for us?
Sure. One moment that stands out to me is when I had to translate again for my mother in law during a medical appointment where important decisions were being discussed. I remember feeling pressure to make sure I was communicating everything exactly as it was said without adding or leaving anything out. It made me realize how high stakes communication can be in healthcare and how easily meaning can be lost if someone is not fully fluent in both languages, which that was the case of my mother-in-law.
And that definitely makes sense, and it does seem like a lot of pressure. And how do those experiences shape the way that you view communication in healthcare?
It really made me appreciate how critical, clear, and professional interpretation is in healthcare. I became more aware that communication is not just about translating words, it's about conveying meaning accurately, especially when decisions about health and treatment are involved. It also made me more sensitive to how vulnerable patients can feel when they don't fully understand what is happening. And I know for sure my mother in law felt like that.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. Now, switching from the personal experience to more professional experience, in your work at school, how often do you find yourself translating for students or their families?
I actually translate multiple times during the week at school,
Oh,
both for students and families.
gotcha. And could you expand a little bit more on what that process looks like?
Usually, we have Spanish speaking families come up to the front office and they need somebody to help them communicate their needs. They will call me, I will come and translate for them. I also translate for my SLP both during screenings and tests administered for speech and language because we have some students that are monolingual and English is not their language.
And with that, what challenges do you find come up when communicating important information across language barriers in the educational setting?
One of the biggest challenges that I find is ensuring accuracy and clarity, especially with complex or sensitive information, because educational terminology doesn't always translate directly. And there's also the risk of misunderstanding expectations or instructions. And another challenge is making sure families feel fully included and not overwhelmed or left out of the conversation.
And with that, how do the families typically respond when language support is or isn't available?
Families are usually very appreciative when language support is available because it helps them feel included and informed. And when it's not available, I've seen frustration, confusion, or hesitation to ask questions. It can sometimes create a barrier where families might not fully engage because they are unsure if they understood everything correctly.
And I definitely think that's an important point to bring up, especially when the families are the child's only point of contact, especially since the child can't advocate for themselves in that kind of setting.
Absolutely.
Now, shifting from an education standpoint to a more healthcare setting, based on your own personal experiences, how do language barriers impact a patient's ability to understand their care or make informed decisions for themselves?
Language barriers can significantly affect a patient's understanding of their condition, treatment options, and instructions.
Oh, how so?
Well, if information is not fully understood, it becomes difficult for patients to make truly informed decisions, which can directly impact outcomes and their sense of control over their care overall.
And with that, since you do have your own personal experience translating for a family member who didn't speak English, what differences do you see between having a trained interpreter versus relying on yourself to be that family member to translate for somebody?
Well, I think that a trained interpreter provides accuracy, neutrality, and confidentiality. They are skilled in medical
Hmm.
terminology and trained to convey information exactly as intended.
And then how did that look different for you when you were the one translating for your mother in law?
Well, I think that I may unintentionally filter information, simplify it, or add their own interpretation, which can lead to misunderstandings. There's also, I feel, an emotional layer for me personally, when I was involved, that I feel that can affect communication.
And that definitely makes sense, especially when we're thinking about how this medical terminology may not be in your everyday vocabulary. So I can definitely see how that can be hard when a medical professional who's used to using that terminology is throwing it at you, and then you're having to translate it into another language that may be unfamiliar for you.
For sure.
And now, kind of building off that last question, nothing against you, but do you think that using family members as interpreters can sometimes be problematic in the healthcare settings?
I think so. For example, that one time that I had to take my mother in law to the hospital, again, she spoke no English. They did not want me to translate, they wanted to use their own people that they had,
Hmm.
which it was actually via a phone or a Zoom link to translate. So no one that was there personally. And when they called, my mother in law could not hear. Then they got someone that spoke Portuguese from Brazil and not Portugal, which the dialect is totally different. And when I asked if I could just do it, they said no. And so it turned out that we had to actually wait a long time because now they're scrambling to find someone to try to translate for my mother in law. And I think that what they ended up doing was using somebody that spoke Spanish and not someone that spoke Portuguese.
Wow, that's actually kind of crazy to me to think about how, their solution was to provide somebody that spoke an entire different language than your mother-in-law.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it myself.
Yeah. And especially it's kind of interesting that in the healthcare setting, time is really of the essence, and it's very important that they would delay her treatment or even a decision to make a treatment because of, access. You didn't have access to someone who spoke the right dialect, and even just her understanding, with like timing issues and connection qualities, of it being in a Zoom call. It's
Hmm.
kind of interesting that even though you were in the room there physically with her, they wouldn't let you, act as a translator, and their solution was somebody who was, over the phone or not even, in the same room. So I really find that interesting. And honestly, it's kind of upsetting.
Yes, it was very frustrating for both her and I.
And just to continue building off of that, how do these language barriers affect a patient's autonomy, their ability to make their own informed choices about their own care?
Well, it can limit a patient's autonomy because they might not fully understand their diagnosis or even treatment options. Without that clear understanding, it becomes difficult for them to make informed choices, which actually can take away some of their control in the decision making process, which in reality is very sad.
Yeah, and that definitely makes sense, especially with, bringing back up the medical terminology that may not be used. It kind of brings up the question on, is everything getting translated fully to the best extent? And, what facts are being missed in that middle step and almost that middle ground for them to make their own decisions? And then I can definitely see how they probably don't even feel comfortable making their own decisions because themselves are not the ones who are being told this. It's being told to that extra outside external person.
Absolutely, yes. And I actually do feel that a lot of that medical terminology is being not translated appropriately,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. I
Yeah.
think there's a gap in there in the communication between, the healthcare provider, the interpreter, then passing it down to the patient.
And then with that, whether it's in the healthcare setting or back in your educational setting at work, have you seen situations where communication barriers, might have impacted the fairness or quality of care that somebody receives?
Absolutely. When these parents don't understand the language and they don't understand the services that we provide for their children, then, it lacks on their care. They're not getting that extra help that they need.
And then do you have any examples of when, a student might have not have gotten the care that they need because of these language barriers with their parents?
Yes. So at the school level, we have to have meetings in place to um, add an IEP, which is an individualized educational plan for a
Mm-hmm.
student. And more often, these parents don't even know what that is. So, which that is a plan that we put in place for that specific child to address their needs. And parents often don't have any idea of what that is. And again, it's because of the barrier of the language.
Yeah, and I can definitely see how, like as a parent, that can be scary, not being involved, not involved in the sense of that, but like not knowing what is happening, at the school and not knowing like what care is being provided to your child. Um, and again, kind of bringing back to that healthcare setting of, kind of relying on a middle person to ensure that all the information that is going to your child is being relayed to you in the best way and that you are, getting correct information.
Yes.
Something I'm thinking about right now is, let's say that you're not there. You're not there to translate for the families. What ethical concerns come up when someone has to rely on a child, whether that be their own child or just a child that speaks their language to interpret this sensitive information?
Well, accuracy, you know,
Mm-hmm.
how is a child accurately interpreting, what's being said? Also, like that emotional burden on them too, because they might not fully understand the information that's been given to them to translate it in an appropriate way. Um, and it might not even be developmentally appropriate for them to be translating for their parents.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, especially, I've seen with kids who speak other languages and do have to translate for family members, kind of makes them have to like grow up at a very young age because they're the direct point of contact.
Yes, absolutely.
And then also, with that, it kind of makes me wonder about the confidentiality portion of that. Even though it is a kid, we are bringing an outside source that
Sensitive information.
exactly, yeah, that is dealing with, whether it be medical or educational information. I do notice that there's like a sense of confidentiality that also is being broken with these kind of conversations.
Absolutely, yes, it is.
And now, if we were, to reflect on kind of this whole conversation, what do you think that these systems could do better to support, both patients and students that have to deal with these language barriers?
Well, I personally think that they could ensure more consistent access to, to train interpreters,
Mm-hmm.
and also including the on-demand services. But for example, at my school, they have tried to implement the on-demand services, but again, it's very costly. And schools, my school, they cannot afford to pay for those services. So then they rely on staff that can interpret. They also could improve on school training on how to work efficiently with interpreters, and make sure that language access is treated just like standard part of care, as a standard part of care.
Yeah, and that's definitely interesting to think about, and that's kind of making me think about a future episode that one of my group members is going to talk about, resource allocation, like when it comes to the funds, when schools or hospitals don't have these funds. It's kind of like, where do they decide to put the money, and how does one decide what services need to be highlighted and what is really important? And kind of makes you think about, they have to make their own ethical decisions on this is where the money's going to go, which ultimately might not help members of lower communities or minorities.
Yes, and I think they also should treat that as not an optional care,
Mm-hmm.
but it needs to be there. They need to have that.
Yeah.
The translating services. So they should allocate money to have that. It shouldn't be optional.
Definitely, yeah. And how can schools and communities, play a part in helping bridge this gap?
Well, schools and communities can help by providing accessible communication tools for families. Partner with interpreter services, making sure that families feel welcomed and informed. Schools in particular, which is my case because that's where I work, they definitely can be a bridge between families and larger systems by ensuring that communication is clear and culturally responsive.
Mm-hmm. And then, what advice would you give to any future healthcare providers, about working with people who do come from linguistically different and diverse populations?
Well, I would definitely advise them to always prioritize professional interpretation services and never assume that a family member is an adequate substitute. It's also important to speak clearly, check for understanding, and be patient, which I think, when somebody comes that doesn't speak English, I don't think there's a lot of patience. And most importantly, approach each interaction with cultural humility.
Mm-hmm.
Just like I said, an awareness of how communication impacts care, because it definitely does. And these people should feel, welcome and treated the same, just like English speaking patients.
Yeah. And I think that also, that just does reflect the overarching issue, not only in a healthcare setting, but just a societal issue that kind of treats people who don't speak this majority language, they treat them differently, which, is kind of sad to think about, especially when you go to these healthcare providers and, you are expecting that they kind of have your best interests out in heart, but, that may not always be the case.
Yes, absolutely.
And then, kind of just to wrap up, is there anything that you wish more people understood about language barriers in healthcare?
Yes, I wish that more people understood that language barriers are not just an inconvenience. It can directly affect safety, understanding, and outcomes. And, even especially in that setting, the healthcare setting, even small understandings can have significant consequences, overall.
Mm-hmm. And then, just one final question for you. What is one takeaway that you hope that our listeners get from, hearing about your experiences?
Well, I hope that people recognize how important clear and equitable communication is in healthcare, and that every patient deserves to fully understand their care, regardless of the language that they speak.
Totally agree with you. Thank you so much for joining me today on this episode. I really loved listening to you and just hearing about your experiences.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed sharing my experiences with you.
Of course. Now, in just one moment, we're going to be right back with the rest of the group to kind of analyze this conversation that I had with Sonia here and see what my other group members think about this topic. All right, listeners, I'm now joined with Riley, Emma, Jamie, and Eileen. Hey guys, thanks for joining me in the discussion today. I'm just going to start us off with a quick overview of the podcast episode. In my episode, I interviewed Sonia, who works as a speech and language pathologist assistant or an SLPA in an elementary school. In the episode, we talked about how language barriers can impact both healthcare and education, and she shared some really eye-opening personal experiences translating for family members in medical settings. Was there anything big that stood out to any of you guys?
One thing that really stood out to me was Sonia's role in the school setting. She works with students one-on-one or in small groups to help with speech sounds, language development, and social communication. She also helps collect progress data and works with teachers and families. It shows how communication support is important, not just academically, but socially too.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that she said she often translates for families at school several times a week. Many Spanish-speaking families come to the front office needing help, and she gets called in to assist. That really shows how common language barriers are in education and how schools rely on bilingual staff to fill those gaps.
Yeah, I agree. Another major point was how language barriers affect parents' ability to advocate for their children. Sonia talked about IEP meetings, where schools discuss individualized education plans for students who need special support. She said many parents don't even know what that is, what IEP is. And that's because no one has ever properly explained it to them in their language.
That connects to fairness too. If parents don't understand the services their child is receiving, they can't ask questions or make informed decisions. So language barriers can directly impact whether students receive the support they need.
Exactly. And then building off of that, we shifted into healthcare, where Sonia shared her experience translating for her mother-in-law who speaks Portuguese and speaks no English. She explained that translating medical information was stressful because she felt the responsibility herself for making sure everything was communicated accurately.
That made sense to me because healthcare terminology can already be confusing in one language, let alone two. Sonia said translating wasn't just about words, it was about making sure meaning, urgency, and treatment options were also understood correctly.
The hospital story was probably the most shocking part to me. The hospital refused to let Sonia translate and instead use their own interpreter system. But the interpreter was remote, her mother-in-law couldn't hear clearly, and they first used someone who spoke Brazilian Portuguese instead of European Portuguese.
And then eventually they used someone who spoke Spanish, which is a completely different language. That was crazy to hear. It delayed care and created more confusion, even though Sonia was physically there and able to help.
That example really showed that simply having interpreter services available is not enough. The interpreter had to speak the correct language or dialect. The technology has to work and communication has to actually be accessible to the patient.
Right. And then after that, we also talked about autonomy. Sonia said that when patients don't fully understand their diagnosis, treatment options, or instructions, they lose the ability to make informed choices about their own healthcare decisions.
Yeah, that's such an important point. If someone doesn't understand what's happening, they're forced to trust others completely, which takes away their independence and control.
We also discussed the issue of using children as interpreters when no adult translator is available. Sonia said that creates ethical problems because children may not understand the information themselves, and they shouldn't carry the emotional burden of translating serious or sensitive topics.
Exactly. Kids shouldn't have to explain medical diagnoses or school decisions to their parents. That's a responsibility that should fall on trained professionals.
Overall, I think the biggest takeaway from this podcast was that language barriers aren't just inconvenient. They create real inequity. They can lower the quality of care in hospitals and prevent families from being involved in schools.
I agree. Sonia's experiences really showed me that communication is directly tied to fairness, autonomy, and access. Because if people can't understand the systems they're in, they can't fully benefit from them. Well, thanks everyone for this great discussion. Tune in next week for Emma's episode where she'll be talking about informed consent with her guest. Thanks, guys. Thank you.